Welcome to the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Petty School Arithmetic program. In this lesson, we're going to continue our study of numbers and counting. We're going to learn to count all the way up to 200 in this lesson. Let's go ahead and get started. You should be able at this point to easily read and count all of the numbers on your screen. Let's count them together to get started. Point to each number and read it aloud with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. We learned that to count up to 20, you need to memorize the names of the numbers. But once you get above 20, things get very, very easy. Let's go ahead and continue counting. How many pennies are on this screen? You don't have to count them all. What you can see is there are two sets of 10 pennies. 2 sets of 10 makes 20. Look at the number 20 written on your screen. You can see that it's written with a 2 in the tens place because there are 2 sets of 10, and a 0 in the units place because there are 0 units left over. 2 sets of 10 is called 20. 20. How many pennies are there in this slide? Again, you don't have to count them all. You can see that there are 3 sets of 10 pennies. 3 sets of 10 pennies is 30. You can see the number written on your screen has a 3 in the tens place because there are 3 sets of 10, and a 0 in the units place because there are 0 units left over. 3 sets of 10 is 30. 30. How many pennies do you see in this picture? Don't count all the pennies. You can see that the pennies are in sets of 10. How many sets of 10 are there? That's the easy way to count them. 1, 2, 3, 4. There are 4 sets of 10 pennies. 4 sets of 10 is 40. There are 40 pennies. You can see the number written on your screen has a 4 in the tens place and a 0 in the units place. There are 4 sets of 10, or 40. 40. How many pennies do you see in this screen? Hopefully you know by now that you don't have to count every single penny. You can see that the pennies are placed in sets of 10. All you have to do is count how many sets of 10 there are. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 sets of 10 pennies. 5 sets of 10 is called 50. If you look at the number 50 written on your screen, you can see that there are 5 tens and 0 units. 5 sets of 10 and 0 units left over. This is 50. 50. How many pennies do you see on this screen? They're set into sets of 10, so we can count how many sets of 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 6 sets of 10 pennies. This is 60. If you look at the number 60 written on your screen, you can see that there is a 6 in the tens place to show how many sets of 10 we have, and 0 in the units place to show how many units are left over. 6 sets of 10 is 60. 60. How many pennies are on this screen? Go ahead and count how many sets of 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There are 7 sets of 10 pennies. 7 sets of 10 is called 70. 70. You can see the number 70 is written with 7 in the tens place because there are 7 sets of 10, and 0 in the units place because there are 0 units left over. 7 tens and 0 units is 70. 70. How many pennies do you see on this screen? Again, we can count how many sets of 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 8 sets of 10 pennies on this screen. If we write this number, we write an 8 in the tens place and a 0 in the units place. 8 tens and 0 units makes 80. 80. How many pennies do you see in this screen? Go ahead and count how many sets of 10. You don't have to count every single penny. That would take too much time. You can see that there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 sets of 10 pennies. 9 sets of 10 makes 90. You can see the number 90 written on your screen. There is a 9 in the tens place to show how many sets of 10 we have, and a 0 in the units place to show that there are 0 units left over. 9 tens and 0 units makes 90. 90. We learned that if there are units left over, when we count all our sets of 10, we simply put that number of units into the units place. Here, there are 9 sets of 10 pennies and 1 penny left over. We've written a 9 in the tens place and a 1 in the units place because there is 1 penny left over. To read this, we would say 91. If there were 2 pennies left over, we would say 92. If there were 3 pennies left over, we'd say 94, and so on all the way up to 99, where we left off in our last lesson. Now we come to a problem that we need to solve. If you were to count the pennies on this screen, you would see that there are 10 sets of 10 pennies. 10 sets of 10. We learned 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. But what do we call 10 sets of 10? What's the name for 10 sets of 10? Well, we've learned that any time we have between 1 and 9, we call them units. Here we have 1 unit. We learned that when we have 10 units, we would call this one set of 10. We would write a 1 in the tens place and a 0 in the units place and call this a 10. So we've got units and we have tens. What comes next? If we have 10 sets of 10, we call this a 100. 10 sets of 10 is called a 100. 100 is written with a 1 in the hundreds place, a 0 in the tens place, and a 0 in the units place. 10 sets of 10 is 100. Earlier, you learned to count units from 1 through 9. We learned 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Then we learned about tens, and you learned to count by tens. 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. Now you can count by hundreds. 100, 200, 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800, 900. You can see that the only numbers that are used are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0. Those are the only numbers that you need to count any number in the whole world. These are the hundreds. Hundreds. How many pennies are on this screen? You can see that there are 10 sets of 10. And we learned that 10 sets of 10 is 100. The gold box shows you that this is one set of 100 pennies. There are 100 pennies in the gold box, but there's 1 penny left over. So here we have 101 pennies. The number 101 is written with a 1 in the hundreds place, a 0 in the tens place, and a 1 in the units place. 101. How many pennies do you see on this screen? You can see that in the gold box there are 10 sets of 10 pennies. And we learned that 10 sets of 10 is 100. We can also see that there are 2 pennies left over. So we have 102 units. This number is 102. There are 102 pennies on this screen. To write the number 102, we write a 1 in the hundreds place, a 0 in the tens place, and a 2 in the units place. 102. How many pennies do you see on this screen? You can see that there is 103 pennies left over. That makes 103. 103. Here you can see that there are 104 pennies. 104. Look at the number written on your screen. Can you read 104? 104. How many pennies do you see on this screen? You can see that there are 100 in the gold box, 10 sets of 10. That's 100. And there are some pennies left over. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 105 pennies on this screen. And you can see the number 105 written in green. There's 100, 0 tens, and 5 units. That's 105. How many pennies are on this screen? You can see that there are 100 pennies in the gold box. But how many are left over? There are 6 pennies left over. How do we say 100 pennies and 6 pennies more? We say 106. And you can see the number 106 written on your screen. 100, 0 tens, and 6 units. 106. Here you can see that there are 107 pennies on your screen. There are 10 sets of 10 pennies, which makes 100, and 7 pennies more. 107. Here you can see 108. 108. On this screen, there are 10 sets of 10 pennies, which makes 100, and 9 pennies more. 109. 109 is written with a 1 in the hundreds place, a 0 in the tens place, and 9 in the units place. 109. On this screen you can see how simple it is to keep counting and counting and counting. Here we have 10 sets of 10 and one more set of 10. 10 sets of 10 makes 100, and 1 10 more gives us 110. To write 110 is very simple. We write a 1 in the hundreds place, a 1 in the tens place, and 0 units. 110. After 110, we simply keep on counting. 111, 112, 113, 114, 115, 116, 117, 118, 119. In this slide, you can see that there is 100 and 2 sets of 10. 2 sets of 10 is 20. So here on your screen, we have 120 pennies. To write the number 120, we write a 1 in the hundreds place, a 2 in the tens place, and 0 in the units place. 100 and 2 sets of 10 makes 120. 120. After 120, we go on counting. 121, 122, 123, 124, 125, 126, 127, 128, 129. How many pennies do you see on your screen now? You can see that there is 100 and 3 sets of 10 left over. 100 and 3 sets of 10 makes 130. Remember that 3 sets of 10 makes 30. Here we have 130. The number is written with a 1 in the hundreds place, a 3 in the tens place, and a 0 in the units place. 130. After 130, we go on counting. 131, 132, 133, 134, 135, 136, 137, 138, 139. How many pennies do you see on this screen? You can see in the gold box there are 10 sets of 10 pennies. That's 100. There are 4 sets of 10 left over. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 sets of 10 makes 40. We have 140 pennies on this screen. To write 140, you write a 1 in the hundreds place, a 4 in the tens place, and a 0 in the units place. 140. I'd like you to see something about these numbers. If I asked you again to count how many pennies were on your screen, but I told you I don't want you to use the word hundred, how would you count them? You could say that there are 14 sets of 10 pennies. 14 sets of 10. If you look at the number 140, you can see that it really says there are 14 sets of 10 and 0 units left over. 14 sets of 10 is the same thing as 140. It's just a different way to look at this number. From 140, we go on counting. 141, 142, 143, 144, 145, 146, 147, 148, 149. How many pennies are on this screen? If you counted how many sets of 10 there are, you would get 15 sets of 10. Another way to count them is to say that there is 105 sets of 10. 5 sets of 10 is 50. 150. You can see that the number is written with a 1 in the hundreds place, a 5 in the tens place, and 0 in the units place. This is 150. From 150, we go on counting. 151, 152, 153, 154, 155, 156, 157, 158, 159. How many pennies do you see in this slide? There are 2 different ways you could count them. You could say there are 16 sets of 10. Or you could say there is 106 sets of 10. 6 sets of 10 makes 60. There are 160 pennies on this screen. 100, 6 tens, and 0 units left over. 160. From 160, we go on counting 161, 162, 163, 164, 165, 166, 167, 168, 169. How many pennies are in this screen? You can count the sets of 10 and say there are 17 sets of 10. Or you could count how many sets of 100 and say there is 100 and 7 tens left over. This is 170. 170 is written with a 1 in the hundreds place, a 7 in the tens place, and 0 in the units place. 170. After 170, we go on counting. 171, 172, 173, 174, 175, 176, 177, 178, 179. How many pennies do you see in this screen? We can count how many sets of 10 there are, and you would find that there are 18 sets of 10. We could also count them by hundreds. We could say there is 108 sets of 10 left over. 108 sets of 10 is 180. 180. From 180, we go on counting. 181, 182, 183, 184, 185, 186, 187, 188, 189. How many pennies are in this screen? You could count how many sets of 10, and you would find that there are 19 sets of 10. Or you could count by hundreds and say there is 109 sets of 10 left over. 109 sets of 10 makes 190. 190. And we can go on counting from 190. 191, 192, 193, 194, 195, 196, 197, 198, 199. Here's the last number we're going to learn in this lesson. How many pennies are on your screen? If you counted them by sets of 10, you would count 20 sets of 10. If you counted them by hundreds, you would have 2 sets of 100. You can see that there are 2 gold boxes full of pennies. Here you have 200 pennies. 200. You can see the number written with a 2 in the hundreds place, a 0 in the tens place, and a 0 in the units place. We've now counted all the way up to 200. Now, if you wanted to keep counting all the way up to 999, you should be able to. You would just continue up from 100 to 200 to 300 to 400 to 500 to 600 to 700, 800, and 900. You can practice that on your own. In our next lesson, we're going to go all the way up to 1,000, and we'll be done counting in this course. How about some Latin? In our last lesson, we learned how to count in Latin all the way up to 99. You can go back and review Lesson 8 to review those Latin numbers. This has been a very long lesson, and we're only going to learn one new Latin number. On your screen, there are 10 sets of 10 pennies, and we just learned that 10 sets of 10 makes 100. The Latin name for the number 100 is centum. Centum. You can also read this as centum or centum. They're all fine. 100 in Latin is centum, and it's written with the symbol C. Centum. Once again, you've learned a lot in this lesson. Let's stop here. Now it's time to study. Go back and review all of this lesson, and go back to old Petty School lessons and make sure you remember all the things we've studied in the past. You're doing a great job, and in our next lesson, we'll be all finished with counting in Petty School Arithmetic. I hope that you've enjoyed this lesson in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Petty School Arithmetic program. As I said, in our next lesson, we're going to finish counting. God bless you.